Her name is Kezia Kate Godwin. She's the owner of Kate's Korner Educational Services, and also Durham's Childcare Collaborative. Kate is a passionate leader and advocate for young children and families, particularly children of color. She integrates a racial equity lens in all that she does. We're very excited to learn from Kate today, and I'm going to stop sharing my screen so we have the opportunity to see you. You can go in speaker view if you like, or stay in gallery mode. Kate, thank you for being with us here this morning. We're excited to have you. I'm wondering if you can just share a little bit about yourself and your work in Durham and elsewhere, particularly as it relates to children's transition to kindergarten.
Absolutely. I am a 32-year veteran in early childhood education. Came to Durham about 3 years ago with a purpose, a really focused purpose. Left Childcare education as a district manager there, and had been with Childcare in different states throughout my career, and just decided that this work that became very relevant to me, I guess it birthed words of what I was experiencing with my own children, what I was experiencing in the classroom with my teachers, my directors, kind of came to life with this research base that Dr. Walter Gilliam out of Yale brought forth a few years ago. And it was concerning the implicit bias in early childhood education that was directly related to the expulsion rate. And it just built a fire in me that I knew that I had to be, not only did I need to understand that more, but I also needed to be an active participant in changing it. So came to Durham a few years ago and started this journey, created Kate's Korner, which was a learning center that we're opening at American Tobacco campus. But during COVID, kind of in the meantime, in between time, I was asked to come and serve our community for those children who didn't have access to the learning pods. So we created a center. It was a great partnership with a tech company. They said, you know, we can help Smashing Boxes. We went into Smashing Boxes. I had a contractor come in and build the space based on the, regulation, and we started services. And I think that was really super eye-opening for me as a early childhood provider, what was really going on after our children left our facilities.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thank you for that introduction. Kate, I'm not sure if you had the opportunity to be on when we were hearing from some parents, Lakeisha and Janita, earlier. So maybe you heard a little bit about what they were sharing about their experience with children who will be going into kindergarten this year. They talked a lot about some of the things you mentioned about access to services, knowing about resources that are available. They talked about having to change schools for their children and being maybe concerned a little bit about lack of diversity in the new schools that they were entering. Also around just building trust in these places that they were getting to know. Some of the things that you might have also heard. I'm wondering if you can just add to, based on your experience working with parents, add anything to that about how parents have been experiencing this pandemic, in particular, Black families and families of color?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Access is the word. Access, having a space to be able to do distance learning. I mean, we had a kindergarten room where we were, and a number of these children had not been in a learning environment other than possibly a Head Start or something they had participated in before. But access before we get to K through 5 is the essential. I was on a breakout and I heard some people talking about the lack of understanding for our private entities and our public entities that serve in early childhood, connecting to the K through 5 in a very meaningful way. I've always referred to that as the bridge. The bridge is always at a loss. And our African-American families are, or I should say just our, global majority students are in this place where if they don't have access, then the getting ready for kindergarten and all the lists and all the things you need to know are not really accessible to them. And I know that some of them were talking about the pain body of how do we reach them? Well, you reach them by making access so that they can be in those spaces so that they can get that information, because we know that the experience of early childhood makes our K-5 experience, all the data shows how much better that is going to be for a child once they go into kindergarten. So my advocacy, my focus is providing and making those spaces, as I did with our school agers. I live that life for our early childhood education community, is making space for children who can't afford it, if it's, vouchers or things like that they need access to. So the experience I saw was I had a lot of kindergartners who didn't have letter recognition, didn't have number recognition, weren't able to spell their names. There were, colors and numbers and things like that are something, of course, that are ingrained in our early childhood curriculums. But not ever having that access or being in those environments, when they get in kindergarten, they're absolutely lost. And so I think that is probably the key piece, is that my parents' pain body for their kindergartners are that they didn't have access prior to. And that's a huge piece. And then the other thing was trust, right? So in the African-American community, there's a kind of a weird thing that goes on. There's no trust if we've not been in the space, but where there's also that communication, and that comes from relatability. That comes from being culturally competent to whom you're speaking to, culturally competent about the environment those children are growing up in. Just being aware, being awoke in those spaces and wanting to know more so that you can, dismantle your implicit bias about that child and their ability, and then open conversations. Our parents are our first teachers. And so they know their children way better than we do. But being able to know that we as experts have to humble ourselves in the area of the social emotional piece that I heard the parents speak about. If you don't have that together, which I consider that the soil, right? How do you plant seed for it to grow if the soil is not prepared for that? And a lot of that is around, knowing that child and knowing them a large amount of information from them. And lastly, I feel like I heard something that was like, I've been screaming this for years, is that we leave early childhood for those who do get into the space for access, and we have tons of information. We heap a portfolio on our students that are through observation, it's through testing, it's all of this information from developmental milestones from infancy all the way up to getting them in pre-K and knowing what they know before they go to kindergarten. Then parents say goodbye. This whole portfolio maybe stays at the house, maybe doesn't even leave the center. So that information is so vital for that kindergarten teacher to know about that student. So this is when I hear about the policies and all the things and bridging those gaps, that's one of those bridges that I think the communication piece needs to happen with private or public early childhood. We need to have more of a, hey, you're about to go to kindergarten. How do we do this? I did it in Texas in a Childcare. All of my pre-K teachers, we met with the kindergarten teachers. We built a rapport. We wanted to know, what did the environment need to look like for a successful year? What was going to happen? It was communication. And I think you just have to be that person who understands there's a gap and reach out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I like that analogy of a bridge in a lot of ways around access to resources as well as communication. And that's something we can be. I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit more about the racial equity piece. You've already mentioned some things around implicit bias. I'm wondering if we can talk a little deeper there about what you see as some key equity issues, in particular racial equity, but other areas for children of color who are transitioning to school, to kindergarten. And what are some ways that you specifically in your work today or before working to address them? And also, just to add to that, what are some things that campaign community partners can be keeping in mind in this area as it relates to kind of supporting equity in their work with educators?
Yeah, I think representation is a big part of this. Our children need to see themselves in their teachers. They need to see themselves in their community. They need to see themselves in their books. They need to be, it's representation is a big piece that we miss in the racial equity piece. I feel comfortable when I can see something that's relatable to me, that I know that I belong to, or that is my life, and it's represented. So I think that from the literacy choices in literacy, representation of myself in the room, in the classroom, even when you're decorating your classroom and getting to understand like what a child would, and from different ethnic backgrounds would want to see to feel welcome. I feel like, when we're advocating as partners, and I have a lot of partners, I have some amazing partners, and I think we're going to talk about that. But when I have these partners, it's an intentional means to make sure that when I walk into a room, I know that a child is going to feel like they're represented in that room. And so sometimes that's a miss. The other pieces that come to mind when I think about the racial equity piece is, other than access and representation, is I guess a level of giving. I guess that implicit bias comes back in with the challenge. I was absolutely beyond my measure surprised about how many of our third and fourth graders were not reading, and go back to didn't know letter recognition, could not like facilitate the smallest of instructions for their math, and they were in third and fourth and fifth grade. So implicit bias is not just I am against you, it's also, oh, I feel bad for you. I think that maybe if with a little more time, and these children just keep getting pushed and pushed, and by the time they're in fifth grade, they're disengaged. And we've all heard the term preschool pipeline to prison, which I live by. I know that it's real. That disengagement comes so soon that the love of learning is out of their hearts before they can even really get started. So some of that, I give some of that to our agencies that work with children. I give some of that to the school districts and the teachers, but I give a lot of that to our parents, right? Because the advocacy piece is huge. They need to be able to advocate for their children. So I think it's, all of those things kind of come into play, and they're forgotten when we're creating these environments and creating these opportunities. We talked on our little breakout about access, like where do we put books? How do children get in touch with having a book, right? I think that it's really, two-part, where we started making decisions about where our money goes in our state. We need to be considering that access to early childhood is essential, and we can minimize this big group of children who are not able to be in those seats. We can start minimizing that by advocating for more dollars in early childhood. If COVID taught us nothing, early childhood, is very important and essential, but it is essential to the journey through K through 12 in a very foundational and meaningful way.
Mm-hmm. No, thank you for that. Earlier in the morning, we were talking about how COVID has impacted kindergarten enrollment with so many kids not even showing up at school virtually or in person, and how that has largely we've seen the steepest declines in children who are in schools in poor neighborhoods, and a lot of whom are children of color. So when you talk about implicit bias and kids being moved along to third grade without being able to read, we think about this group of kids who haven't had school this year entering kindergarten and first grade with an even wider disparity of skills. And how do we address that? You talked about partnerships. I want to talk more about the partnerships that you have created, because a lot of the folks in this room and as a part of the campaign are not a part of, preschool providers or kindergarten providers, their community agencies. Can you share more about some successful partnerships that you've had with other community organizations as well as public organizations in supporting children and families transitioning to kindergarten or otherwise?
Absolutely. I'm very proud of Durham. when this COVID whole episode began, they became very active in trying to find providers who could provide the space and create the pods, I would say, for those who did not have a pod in their neighborhood. So I would like to lean away from most vulnerable because they're the most brilliant children that we were serving. But we had the county and the city come together and they brought money to the table to say, let's make this happen. And then we also had partners like the Book Harvest, who brought us books and made sure that we had plenty of books for our students. I further tried to make sure that the partnership or what we were creating was really taking care of the social emotional needs. So I hired a company called Upward Change that they partner with Durham Public Schools usually, but I had a psychologist and her team come in the summertime and really just do like morning groups and really talk through like any of the things that the children were going through. The majority of the people that I served were in the McDougall Terrace neighborhood. And I don't know if you're from North Carolina, you know that McDougall Terrace went through a very horrific time a few years ago with gas leakage in their community. And so it was just a very big uproar about how children were going to be served in that way. So I'm glad to see that that's coming back, together. The local schools were very, very instrumental. Burton Elementary, the principal there was amazing. And, teachers got things together for us to make sure that, we were hitting on the reading aspect during the summer. And then Village of Wisdom, which some of you might have heard of in Durham, they're amazing. They helped us tremendously, and we still have a parent advocacy outreach Saturday that we are sponsoring to make sure that when children are going into kindergarten, the parents have the right questions to ask. They know their children better than anything. Village of Wisdom helps them see the genius in their children, and that partnership was very, very instrumental, so that the parents could find their voice and then help to have those conversations with their children and as well as the administration. So those are great partnerships that we started with, and it continues to grow. People understand my work, although I'm kind of getting out of the COVID-19 type funded childcare and going into American Tobacco soon. We're in a place, I guess, that we're going to do the work. We're going to absolutely do the work, and we cannot do it alone. So when I speak to all those who are online, like you all are a community of collaborators and you want to make things work, those are open conversations. Those are getting to know, the community that you're serving is essential. If you all remember the high scope research that happened in order to create Head Start was based on 98% African-American participation for that group to understand what was going on. But those teachers went into the community. They found out what those children were experiencing, and that builds trust. I wouldn't have been successful if I wouldn't have been intentionally trying to be trustworthy and build trust with my parents. Our school districts don't do a great job at that. They really don't. There's a crazy thing in the United States that you're just supposed to trust and drop your children off and roll. But for 4 or 5 years of their life, you're in the center, and somebody bites your child, you're coming to see about it. And then all of a sudden you don't advocate the same way because we're taught to just give them over. But that's a partnership. It stays in place. So I think that when we're out talking about our programs, we're seeking those individuals out who might not have access to our program or many other programs. And we start communicating about how we can help in a better and more meaningful way.
Yeah, you've talked about a lot of different partnerships. You talked about a private partnership with Smashing Boxes. You've talked about schools. You've talked about Book Harvest, other groups. And you've also, can you share more about what qualities those partners had that made you want to partner with them, that made that partnership successful? You've talked about communication being one of them, like coming together to communicate. Are there other things that you're looking for in the partnerships that you build as as a preschool and provider?
Having real talk. I think we come to these things sometimes in tables and this is just a matter of changing systematic oppressing systems that help us, that, kind of hinder our understanding of each other. Someone asked me, I have a nonprofit that we are starting called Truth Foundation and Education Foundation, and it's based on just research on how the implicit biases and how things keep us from connecting in and just having genuine conversations on how to help, which of course in turn builds the trust. But I think that it's so important for partners to have real conversations on what have we done in the past and why do we keep doing this if it's not effective? And if we're doing it and it's not effective, then do we really want to solve a problem? And if we do, then maybe we need to rewrite how we reach out. Maybe we need to rewrite and rethink about the boundaries that we like completely put around ourselves before we jump in to go do something else. This old mentality is what got us here in the first place, right? George Floyd has been happening in our community for eons. The reason now that it's open and now we can also talk about it, these are the now times to make these forums real and invite you in and not have a chip on my shoulder like you need to learn all about my history and all the things before we can have a conversation. That is not the way that happens. We have to see each other, hear each other, and know each other. And I believe that the only way that this comes together is there's vulnerability on each side. There's no blaming, but there is resolution talk. And how do we make it better moving forward? So I think that these partners saw that. They had real talk with me, even from the owner of Smashing Boxes, who is hyper aware, the prejudices that he had in his own heart, and took the time to like talk through things with other people, myself, whoever it was, and stood in a place of, I'm not certain, but I want to learn. And I think that that's essential. I won't know you unless I ask you about yourself and that we have a vulnerable conversation. And I think it's just time to dismantle all of the things that we've done before because they don't work. They absolutely don't work.
Real talk.
Real talk.
Real talk, genuine conversations, being vulnerable on both sides. Those are things that I heard. I'm sure you all have heard other things. I forgot to mention earlier, but we have some time for the group to also ask Kate questions. So feel free to put those in the chat, or I'll just add one more question for Kate, and then I'll open it up to all of you. So be thinking of what you might want to ask Kate. Kate, you've already shared a lot of great advice and pointers for us in our work, but is there any other piece of advice that you have for the campaign partners in the meeting today who want to really improve their work with families, in particular families of color who have children that are entering preschool and kindergarten, in particular also just partners in this room who are not people of color? How can we continue? You've already talked about some things, but just any other advice that you would have for us?
I think the biggest advice I have is be doers, be advocates, be disruptors, change what is not working. When you're in a meeting and the board says we should do this, and you know very well that that wasn't effective for 3 years in a row, speak up and make the space. Advocacy and having allies mean you stand in that gap and say, that's not going to get it. That's not going to get it. Like, we've done it a number of times before. Maybe we should bring someone in who has a different idea, or we need to approach. And if you have an idea, like, speak up in those spaces. Don't allow your voice to be muted, because advocacy means that you're going to also most times go against the grain. I'm so comfortable with going against the grain. I'm okay. I don't care what people think about it. I am busy trying to make sure that children who I serve, and here's the thing, like, when people say, well, you're for Black children, I'm like for all children, right? So if we don't get our children, Black, white, Hispanic, I don't care who you are, if we don't get our children to understand and love one another for themselves, and that we stop putting this placated idealism like about who those children are before our kids even get into school, like, who do they play with and who do they not, until we start having those real conversations, and being able to love a child for their Irish Catholic background, whatever it is, then that authenticity basically comes back to being a human, right? It just comes back to teaching our children that we are all humans and that there's a level of respect and honor that comes through that. So that's pretty much what I would say. Be doers, be the people who speak up, change the game, and advocate your butts off when you know that it's needed. And don't be silent when, forces of yesterday try to speak out and keep things oppressed.
That is a word for us. Thank you. Be doers. Butts off. Does anyone, any questions from the room, the meeting, folks in the meeting today for Kate? Just make sure there's nothing in the chat box.
This is Henrietta. I just want to say thank you so much. I think we all needed that this morning. So it was
awesome.
Inspirational.
You're more than welcome.
Very inspirational. I have a question that came up just as others are thinking during the conversation with parents that we didn't have a chance to answer. And that was, what are some ways that we can continue to really engage parent voices in our work, parents as leaders? How can we do that well? And I know that there's lots to say about that, but maybe one piece of advice or something that you've seen work well in your work or in other work about engaging parent voices.
There is a board member by the name of Giovanni Lewis that sits on the Durham Public School board, and she has a company called Epic, and basically she goes and gets parents or gathers parents together after they've learned some advocacy through Village of Wisdom, or she teaches some of that herself, but she brings them together in the schools. So they kind of create a parent, a voice for the parents of their children. So inviting them to one thing is different, but then coming to something, empowering them to let them know that they need to be heard, and then making sure that they continue to gather together for the things that are coming about. Schools are always changing things. There could be changing of schedules. There could be IEP confusion, or there could be so many things that they can speak to as a group and really kind of hash out themselves and get an understanding. That camaraderie, which, some people say, well, that's a PTA. Well, people of color have not always been able to go to a PTA meeting in the middle of the day. Those parents have to work, right? Those parents have to work, and there might be other obstacles, the transportation or whatever it might come. So it's being intentional. When I have a meeting, I feed them, I have childcare, and I make sure that everyone can get there. And then I sometimes give them a stipend because it is their time and it's valuable. So making sure that when you bring parents together, that you're not just saying, oh, I just wanted to check in and it's high level. That doesn't stick with parents. That consistent conversation, which builds trust, again, brings about parents' willingness to participate. And the next thing you know, you can back up. They're there and they're coming to get advice, but they're moving that train along. So I think having those, times where it's accessible to others and making sure that they're cared for and taken care of, and that means is just the extra step we have to go because we've never really done it before. Yeah.
Thank you. In the chat box to make sure I didn't miss any other questions. If I did, Lisa, let me know. I do see some requests for your contact information. People are excited to hear about your work and learn about you. So if it's okay with you, we might share that with just these groups, knowing that you are also very busy. If there are no other questions from the group, so let me just see here. What we got here? Kate, thank you so much for being with us here today and closing our meeting. This was a really encouraging and inspiring and challenging talk. And thank you for all that you're doing in Durham and the ways that you've equipped us this morning. We appreciate your time.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.